Trump has just escalated his attack on Canada, and it's unlike anything we've seen before. This isn't just politics. This is a full-blown war on Canadian culture. Streaming platforms, trade agreements, sovereignty itself, everything is on the line. And standing firm in the eye of the storm is Mark Carney. Within minutes of Trump's latest ultimatum, Carney made a move that left Washington stunned and global markets on edge. What happens next could redefine U.S.-Canada relations forever. On March 20th, 2026, the United States government, led by Donald Trump, escalated tensions with Canada in a move that stunned diplomats and economists alike. Trump issued a shocking ultimatum. Canada had just 72 hours to comply with demands that would hand over control of domestic policy to the United States, or face crippling tariffs across multiple industries. 72 hours. For a sovereign nation of 40 million people, the 10th largest economy in the world with deep trade and defense ties to the U.S., that's an impossible deadline. Yet Trump framed it as a simple business decision, expecting Canada to drop everything and obey. This ultimatum wasn't just a trade maneuver, it was an assault on the very idea that Canada could make decisions about its own economy, its own culture, and its own future. The core of the dispute? Canada's Online Streaming Act. Passed in 2023, the law requires major streaming platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus to contribute a portion of their profits from Canadian subscribers back into Canadian content. That means Canadian films, Canadian TV shows, Canadian voices, Canadian stories. It's a simple, reasonable policy that ensures Canada retains control over its culture in the digital age. American broadcasters have faced similar rules for decades. The idea is not revolutionary, it's standard. And yet, the United States treated it as a provocation worthy of economic war. Trump's demands went beyond content quotas. He wanted Canada to agree to new trade rules that would effectively make the U.S. the ultimate authority over Canadian domestic policy. He wanted Canada to abandon protections for its industries, its workers, and yes, its culture. In effect, he wanted Canada to submit, to become subordinate, to accept American control over decisions that have nothing to do with trade deficits or corporate profits. It was economic imperialism wrapped in the language of trade. What happened next was a masterclass in diplomatic defiance. Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, didn't respond with empty rhetoric. He didn't play the political theater game. Within minutes of the ultimatum being issued, Carney made a public statement that was as clear as it was uncompromising. Canada would not surrender control over its domestic policies. Full stop, no discussion. He framed Canada as a sovereign nation, equal in negotiations, not a subsidiary of the United States. And he didn't just speak words, he set the stage for action. Markets immediately reacted. Energy prices fluctuated wildly. Agricultural exports were sent into panic mode. Farmers on both sides of the border understood the stakes. Retaliatory tariffs and trade disruption were imminent. And yet, Carney didn't blink. This was a calculated display of strength. It told the world that Canada was no longer a dependent, pliable partner. This moment marks a dramatic shift in North American geopolitics. Over the last 2 years, Canada has been systematically reducing its economic reliance on the United States. Trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, and China have created alternatives that make threats from Washington less terrifying. Canada has cultivated leverage and options in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Trump's strategy assumes economic dependency, that Canada has no choice but to bow to U.S. demands. Carney's response proves that assumption false. Canada can say no. And when it does, it sends a message far beyond North America. Economic intimidation does not always work, even against the United States. The Online Streaming Act itself is deceptively simple, but its implications are enormous. By requiring streaming platforms to invest in Canadian content, Canada asserts control over the digital future of its culture. Algorithms must include Canadian programming and recommendations, revenue from the Canadian market must support Canadian production, and foreign corporations operating in Canada are obliged to respect the cultural ecosystem. Trump's administration framed this as a trade violation, but that's not accurate. The United States has long regulated its own broadcasters to serve public interests. Educational content, licensing requirements, and FCC oversight ensure that American networks contribute to society. Canada is simply applying the same principle in a modern digital context. The outrage from Washington is less about trade and more about maintaining dominance over cultural and economic space in the hemisphere. Trump's approach has been consistent. From suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state to referring to Canadian leaders as governors, he has repeatedly diminished Canada's status as a sovereign nation. Every insult, every rhetorical slight, every threat of tariffs is part of a larger pattern of subordination. But Carney understands that surrender is not an option. He knows that giving in to threats doesn't protect Canadian jobs or industries. It destroys national pride, independence, and identity. Energy and agriculture are the first battlefronts. Canada supplies more oil to the U.S. than any other country. American refineries in the Midwest are specifically designed for Canadian crude. You cannot replace that supply quickly. Canadian farmers rely heavily on exports to the United States, and American farmers rely on Canadian markets as well. Threats of tariffs in these sectors create a delicate hostage situation. Both countries could be hurt, both sides have leverage, but Carney's stance shows that Canada is prepared to endure temporary pain to defend sovereignty. It's a gamble, yes, but one calculated with knowledge of alternatives and strategic depth. Carney's long-term plan is now clear. Over the past 2 years, Canada has diversified trade, strengthened ties with the European Union, Japan, and China, and reduced its vulnerability to American coercion. The U.S. may still be Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only option. When Trump issues ultimatums, Canada can respond without panic. When Washington threatens tariffs, Canada can negotiate from strength rather than desperation. This shift represents a historic reversal in the North American balance of power. And it all stems from one simple fact. Carney recognized that sovereignty and independence cannot be negotiable, even in the face of immense pressure. This is about much more than trade or streaming services. It's about whether Canada gets to control its future, its culture, its economy, and its identity. Trump's threats are designed to erode that control. Carney's response is designed to protect it. And the stakes? Nothing less than the precedent it sets for how the United States treats its allies in the 21st century. Every other country is watching. Every other country understands that this confrontation will define the limits of U.S. power, and Canada has just made it clear there are limits. The heart of this confrontation isn't oil, agriculture, or even trade deficits. It's culture. Donald Trump's attacks on Canada are about more than economics. They're about control. When a country loses the ability to regulate its own cultural landscape, it loses the power to define its identity. The Online Streaming Act is Canada's shield against cultural erasure in a digital age dominated by American entertainment giants. Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney+, these platforms reach millions of Canadians every day. Without Canadian content requirements, every algorithm, every recommendation, every trending series would tilt toward American stories. Slowly, invisibly, Canadian voices would fade from the airwaves. And that's exactly what the U.S. attack is designed to prevent, not to protect American businesses in a fair way, but to dominate Canadian culture entirely. Trump's administration frames the act as a trade barrier, but that's a deliberate misrepresentation. It's not about commerce, it's about influence. American lawmakers, led by Representative Lloyd Smucker, introduced legislation to launch a Section 301 investigation targeting Canada's cultural policies. Section 301 allows the United States Trade Representative to investigate foreign practices deemed harmful to U.S. business. It gives Washington the power to impose unilateral remedies, tariffs, trade restrictions, and sanctions, all without international oversight. In essence, it's a weaponized mechanism to pressure sovereign nations into compliance. Canada's Online Streaming Act isn't just under scrutiny, it's under siege. And Trump's demands accompanying it make clear what's at stake: submission or economic punishment. Carney immediately understood the broader implications. This isn't just a domestic policy dispute, it's about the principle of sovereignty. If Canada cedes control over its streaming platforms, it sets a precedent. The United States could, in theory, claim the right to veto any policy in any allied nation that interferes with American corporate interests. That principle alone threatens the foundations of global governance, trade, and diplomacy. Carney's response wasn't just about Netflix and Disney+. It was a declaration that Canada will not let economic coercion dictate its culture. It was a signal to the world. Sovereignty is non-negotiable. The stakes were magnified by the timing. Summer 2026 was set for the scheduled review of KSMA, the North American Trade Agreement. Designed as a routine evaluation to adjust and improve the pact between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, it was supposed to be procedural, calm, and collaborative. Instead, Trump weaponized it. Ultimatums, tariffs, and legislative attacks transformed a standard review into a high-stakes battlefield. Carney recognized the strategic danger. If Canada appeared weak or indecisive, Trump could leverage the review to extract concessions, not just on streaming, but on a host of domestic policies. This could redefine the balance of power across North America. Carney's rapid, firm rejection of the ultimatum disrupted that strategy entirely. Public perception in Canada played a critical role. Across the political spectrum, from progressives to conservatives, there was near universal support for defending sovereignty. Carney's decisiveness tapped into a sense of national pride. Americans might expect internal divisions or political wrangling to undermine Canada's position, but the opposite occurred. Each aggressive move by Trump further united Canadians. Every threat, insult, or legislative attack reinforced a narrative: Canada must protect itself against external coercion. This is the kind of strategic miscalculation that even the most seasoned political operatives struggle to overcome. Trump's approach assumed that economic intimidation would fracture Canadian unity. Instead, it created a rally around the flag effect. Resistance became a matter of national identity. Energy and agriculture remained flashpoints. Canada supplies more oil to the United States than any other nation. Midwest refineries rely on Canadian crude. At the same time, Canadian producers depend on the U.S. market with limited infrastructure to redirect exports elsewhere quickly. The agricultural sector is similarly intertwined. American and Canadian farmers are linked in a delicate cross-border ecosystem. Tariffs would hurt both sides. Carney's willingness to weather that pain was a calculated gamble, but one grounded in long-term strategy. By demonstrating that Canada could absorb short-term economic shocks, he sent a clear signal: sovereignty outweighs temporary profit or convenience. Meanwhile, diversification of trade partnerships has been quietly but aggressively reshaping Canada's leverage. Agreements with the European Union, Japan, and even China have created options beyond the American market. These aren't casual gestures, they're deliberate preparations. Canada isn't just resisting threats, it's building the capacity to survive them. When Trump expects panic, he finds strategy. When he expects submission, he encounters resolve. Carney's approach turns conventional power dynamics upside down. Canada can now negotiate from a position of strength rather than fear. And there's a broader lesson here for the world. Other nations are watching closely. The United States has relied on its economic weight to shape allied nations' policies for decades. If Canada is forced to bend under pressure, it sets a precedent. Any country can be coerced. If Canada resists, and Carney has ensured it can, the precedent flips. Sovereign nations can resist economic bullying. Diversification works. Strategic planning pays off. Resistance is not just possible, it can be effective. Trump's focus on Canadian culture is particularly telling. Streaming platforms may seem trivial compared to military power or trade volumes, but they are the front lines of influence. Algorithms shape perception, recommendation engines determine attention, and the content consumed daily reinforces identity. By challenging Canada's ability to regulate streaming, Trump is attempting not just to control profits, but to influence culture itself. Carney's immediate, uncompromising response shows that culture matters, national identity matters, and markets, though shaken, will ultimately adjust to political will when sovereignty is defended. In this section of the story, one fact stands out above all others. Canada is no longer the passive partner it once was. Under Carney's leadership, it is prepared for conflict without aggression. It has anticipated threats, diversified options, and built unity at home. The U.S., for all its size and power, is confronting a country that refuses to bow. And this isn't theoretical. Every tariff threat, every legislative maneuver, every presidential insult is being met with planning, strategy, and resilience. Carney's approach demonstrates that true power isn't just economic. It's the ability to defend principles and withstand pressure. This isn't just a trade story. It's a story about who controls influence in the digital age, who sets the rules for national identity, and who decides the limits of American power. Streaming platforms, energy markets, agriculture, they are all just instruments in a larger battle over sovereignty. Trump's economic intimidation may shake markets in the short term, but Carney has ensured that Canada's long-term position is unassailable. By defending culture, by defending policy, by defending independence, Canada is redefining the North American relationship. And Trump is discovering, perhaps too late, that threats alone cannot bend a country that knows its own worth. Trump's approach to Canada has never been subtle, but the legislation introduced by Republican lawmakers in March 2026 marked a new level of aggression. This wasn't just about trade disputes or tariffs. It was an attempt to assert control over Canada's domestic decisions, to make a sovereign nation answer to American corporations, and to challenge the very idea that Canada can govern itself. The Section 301 investigation, which the legislation triggers, gives the United States Trade Representative the power to investigate, judge, and punish Canada unilaterally. There's no international review, no independent oversight, just the full weight of American economic might directed at a friendly neighboring country. It's a textbook example of coercive diplomacy, and Carney understood immediately what was at stake. The online streaming sector, often underestimated in terms of influence, became the battlefield for this confrontation. Platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and others dominate the daily lives of Canadians. Algorithms don't just entertain, they shape cultural perception, influence trends, and define which voices are amplified. The Online Streaming Act, passed in 2023, ensured that Canadian content had a place in that ecosystem. By demanding contributions from streaming platforms, the Act guarantees that Canadian stories, music, and films survive in a market saturated with U.S. content. For Trump and his allies, this was not about protecting business fairness. It was about undermining Canada's control over its cultural landscape. And the United States was prepared to threaten tariffs and retaliatory measures to enforce compliance. Carney, however, refused to react with panic. His strategy was clear: Canada would not bend, and it had the preparation to back it up. The public statement rejecting Trump's 72-hour ultimatum was not rhetoric. It was a calculated move designed to demonstrate confidence and resolve. Markets reacted violently at first, with energy prices swinging and agricultural supply chains teetering, but these disruptions were temporary. Canada's diversified trade portfolio with the European Union, Japan, and China created alternatives that softened the blow. Unlike in previous decades, when Canada's economy was tightly bound to U.S. demand, Carney had built resilience into the system. The message was unmistakable. Canada could endure short-term economic pain without compromising sovereignty. What made this confrontation extraordinary was the combination of timing, strategy, and global visibility. Summer 2026 was slated for the KSMA review, a routine evaluation of North American trade agreements. Traditionally, these reviews were procedural, aimed at fine-tuning trade rules, adjusting quotas, and discussing minor improvements. Trump turned it into a lever for coercion, pairing threats of tariffs with legislative action and public ultimatums. Carney's response reframed the dynamic entirely. Canada would participate in the review, but on its own terms, not under duress. The world watched as a relatively small country in population and economy stood up to the world's largest economy and told it, "We are equals and sovereignty is non-negotiable." Meanwhile, the economic undercurrents were complex and high stakes. Energy and agriculture were just the tip of the iceberg. Canada supplies more oil to the United States than Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. Its agricultural exports, from grains to dairy to meat, are intertwined with American supply chains. Tariffs in these sectors could create a temporary economic shock for both nations. But Carney's strategy was long-term: absorb manageable short-term pain to establish principles that would protect the country for decades. It's a delicate balance of risk and leverage, and it was executed with precision. The United States could threaten, Canada could endure. That simple fact alone transformed the balance of power. Public sentiment in Canada played a pivotal role. Across party lines, citizens rallied behind Carney's leadership. Unlike the U.S., where Trump's threats might sow internal division, Canada experienced the opposite. Each insult, each ultimatum, each legislative attack reinforced national unity. Opposition parties joined in, labor unions and business groups aligned, and public discourse centered on defending sovereignty. This broad support not only strengthened Carney's negotiating position, it sent a signal to the world that Canada was prepared to enforce its principles without fear of internal fracture. Every attempt at coercion only hardened Canadian resolve. Trump's tactics also revealed a deeper misunderstanding of modern geopolitics. The United States had relied on Canada's economic dependence for decades, assuming that threats and ultimatums would create compliance. Carney turned that assumption on its head. By strategically diversifying trade and reinforcing domestic policy autonomy, Canada ensured it could respond to coercion without capitulation. This shift isn't just tactical, it's transformative. Canada no longer reacts out of necessity, it acts from choice, calculation, and principle. In practical terms, the Online Streaming Act illustrates why this cultural and economic battle matters. Streaming platforms dominate digital consumption, algorithms shape perception, and revenue flows influence what gets made, promoted, and watched. By ensuring contributions to Canadian content, the Act guarantees a cultural footprint that persists across generations. Trump's attacks attempt to neutralize this control. Carney's defense safeguards it. This isn't hypothetical, it's about identity, about who controls the narrative of a nation in the 21st century. Every action in this conflict has been watched globally. Other nations are taking notes. The U.S. has long relied on its economic power to shape policies in allied nations, assuming compliance is inevitable. Canada's defiance under Carney challenges that assumption. It demonstrates that strategic preparation, unity at home, and diversification abroad can counter even the most aggressive economic intimidation. It proves that sovereignty can be defended without provoking catastrophic consequences if approached intelligently and decisively. This confrontation also highlights a growing divergence in priorities. Trump's focus on immediate profit and corporate control contrasts sharply with Canada's focus on long-term cultural and economic resilience. The U.S. approach emphasizes coercion. Canada emphasizes planning. Trump seeks submission. Carney seeks principles. That divergence isn't just ideological, it's operational. The United States may have scale and influence, but Canada has preparation, unity, and strategic patience. And in conflicts like this, patience can be more powerful than brute force. By defending culture, policy, and national identity, Canada has also created leverage beyond economics. It has sent a warning to other allies. American economic power is formidable, but it is not absolute. Nations that plan, diversify, and unite internally can resist even the most threatening tactics. Carney has turned a moment of crisis into an example of disciplined statecraft, proving that courage paired with strategy can achieve results that sheer power alone cannot. At the center of all of this is a fundamental principle: sovereignty is not negotiable. The stakes extend far beyond streaming, tariffs, or trade agreements. They touch on identity, self-determination, and the ability to govern without external coercion. Trump's threats are a test of those principles. Carney's response has shown that Canada will not fail that test. Markets may sway, politicians may shout, but Canada's resolve remains steadfast. This confrontation isn't over. But one thing is clear, the narrative has shifted. Canada is no longer a reactive player. It is a proactive, prepared, and determined nation, capable of defending its rights against even the most aggressive adversaries. By the time the Trump ultimatum hit Canadian headlines, the situation had already escalated far beyond streaming platforms or trade agreements. This was no longer about profits or quotas. It was about sovereignty itself. Trump's threats, combined with Smucker's legislation, made one thing painfully clear. The United States intended to assert authority over a neighboring democracy. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't diplomatic, it was raw power projection aimed at reshaping Canada's domestic landscape to favor American corporations. But Carney had anticipated this. He understood that capitulation would mean far more than lost revenue. It would mean surrendering the principle that a nation controls its own destiny. Canada's immediate response, led by Carney, was surgical. Within hours of the announcement, Canada's government and trade advisors reviewed the entire spectrum of potential economic repercussions, from energy and agriculture to digital services and cross-border manufacturing. Every possible scenario was analyzed. What would happen if the U.S. imposed tariffs on oil and gas? How would Canadian farmers withstand retaliatory measures? Could alternative markets absorb the shortfall? Carney knew that preparation was the ultimate weapon against coercion. By mapping out every contingency, Canada transformed uncertainty into leverage. The U.S. expected panic. Instead, it encountered calculated resilience. The stakes in energy were extraordinary. Canada exports more oil to the United States than any other country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Venezuela. Yet pipelines, refinery capacity, and distribution networks create mutual dependence. American refineries are designed specifically for Canadian crude, and Canadian producers rely heavily on the U.S. market. Threats of tariffs could create short-term chaos, but they could not break a strategy grounded in foresight. Carney's team ensured that Canada could absorb disruptions while signaling strength. Every fluctuation in energy markets became a message. Canada is prepared, and it is unyielding. Agriculture presented a similar high-stakes challenge. Millions of tons of food, from wheat and corn to dairy and meat, cross the U.S.-Canada border each year. Supply chains are tightly integrated, meaning tariffs or restrictions would hurt farmers on both sides. Yet Carney's approach was clear. National pride and sovereignty outweigh temporary inconvenience. Canada's willingness to accept short-term economic hardship signaled resolve and reinforced credibility. The message was unmistakable. Canada will not negotiate away principles even in the face of immediate risk. Beyond energy and agriculture, the Online Streaming Act represented the symbolic front of this cultural and economic confrontation. The law's requirements, Canadian content quotas, revenue reinvestment, algorithmic inclusion, are modest but potent. They ensure Canadian stories, voices, and identities survive in a media landscape dominated by American corporations. Trump's attacks were not about fairness. They were about dominance. By framing the act as a trade violation, the U.S. sought to pressure Canada into abandoning control over its cultural future. Carney refused to concede. This was not just policy, it was identity. By defending Canadian content, he was defending the nation's right to define itself. The international dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. Other nations were watching carefully. Europe, Japan, and even China took note of the United States' willingness to impose unilateral measures on a close ally. Carney's decisive response sent a signal that sovereign nations can resist coercion if prepared strategically. Every country in the global trading system understood the stakes. Acquiescing to economic intimidation is optional, not inevitable. Canada's actions demonstrated that resilience, diversification, and unity create leverage far beyond traditional power metrics. Public perception played an equally critical role. Canadians from all political backgrounds, from rural towns to major urban centers, rallied behind Carney's leadership. Each aggressive move from Washington strengthened the sense of unity. Citizens recognized the existential nature of the confrontation. This was about defending national identity against external pressure. Unlike in the United States, where political polarization might dilute the effectiveness of a threat, Canada experienced cohesion, amplifying the government's strategic position. Every attack reinforced the rally around the flag effect. Trump's strategy of intimidation backfired spectacularly. Carney's long-term vision became increasingly clear as this confrontation unfolded. By diversifying trade partnerships, strengthening relationships with the European Union, Japan, and China, and solidifying domestic consensus, Canada created options that allowed principled resistance without catastrophic consequences. Short-term economic pain became tolerable when weighed against long-term sovereignty. Markets and politicians alike began to realize that Trump's leverage was less effective than anticipated. The United States was confronting a nation with not just the will to resist, but the capacity to endure. Trump's approach, rooted in immediate economic gain and coercion, collided with a strategy built on preparation, unity, and resilience. The US may have scale, but Canada had strategy. Trump sought submission, Carney insisted on principle. Trump threatened retaliation, Carney absorbed risk. The juxtaposition was stark, dramatic, and historically significant. The confrontation revealed a profound truth. In global politics, power is not only measured by size or immediate influence, it is also measured by planning, foresight, and the courage to act decisively. By defending culture, policy, and sovereignty, Canada reframed the entire conflict. This wasn't a minor trade dispute, it was a test of modern principles in international relations. Streaming platforms and content quotas were the visible battlegrounds, but energy, agriculture, and trade diversification formed the hidden strategy. Carney's leadership demonstrated that sovereignty is not just a political concept, it is a tangible asset that can be defended with intelligence, patience, and resolve. Finally, this confrontation had global reverberations. Other nations, observing how Canada handled American economic aggression, began reconsidering their own dependence on U.S. markets. The precedent was clear: economic intimidation is not infallible. With preparation, resilience, and strategic alliances, a smaller nation could withstand pressure from the world's largest economy. Carney had transformed what appeared to be a unilateral threat into a moment of global demonstration. Sovereignty, unity, and planning can outweigh brute economic force. Trump's threats, while designed to dominate, ended up exposing the limits of unilateral power. Canada's strategy, patience, and resolve turned a crisis into a demonstration of how smaller nations can navigate asymmetric pressure. Markets, citizens, and governments around the world learned a lesson in real time. Preparation and principle are as powerful as size and might. And at the center of it all was Carney, orchestrating a response that balanced diplomacy, strategy, and national pride. The confrontation was far from over, but the narrative had shifted. Canada was no longer reactive, it was proactive. Trump may have expected panic, but what he found was a calculated, measured, and unwavering defense of sovereignty. The stakes extended far beyond North America. This was about who sets the rules in a globalized world, who determines the limits of economic coercion, and who controls cultural and political identity in the digital age.